I'm speaking with Itamar Marcus. Mr. Marcus is founder and director of Palestinian Media Watch. It's an organization that reveals the reality of Palestinian society by monitoring Palestinian mass media and translating it into English. It also monitors speeches by Palestinian political and religious leaders, as well as the Palestinian educational system. PMW's findings reveal a consistent pattern of demonization of Jews and Israel, an outright rejection of any idea of making peace with the Jewish state, and the commitment to utterly destroy Israel, no matter what the cost to themselves. They also show how the Palestinian Authority indoctrinates its children from the very earliest age to want to become suicide bombers. Mr. Marcus has testified a number of times before the U.S. Congress and before the parliaments of other Western countries. In February 2007, he held a press conference together with Senator Hillary Clinton to release a report on the latest PA school books, which showed their outright rejection of Israel's existence and their glorification of hatred and violence against it. Mr. Marcus lectures frequently at universities and conferences around the world, and his website, www.pmw.org.il, is filled with graphic video clips taken directly from the Palestinian media. Itamar, how long have you been operating this Palestinian Media Watch?
11 years.
And what is the basis of what you found? If I were to go to your website right now, what kind of things would I expect to see on it?
Well, we do a lot of focusing on Palestinian children. We see children as the key to any future peace in the Middle East. And what you'll find is that children have been given a very, very straightforward message, that Israel has no right to exist. In fact, the school books literally build for the child an image of a world without Israel. Israel doesn't appear on the maps. The texts talk about the state of Palestine having going from the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, which of course includes all of Israel. So both in verbal expression as well as pictures and images, Israel doesn't exist in the school books, except for when describing Israel's creation, where they refer to the Zionist gangs who stole Palestine. So it's very, very problematic. In addition, even the newest school books, these are for grade 12, just came out, and these are the ones that I released at a press conference with Hillary Clinton. The newest school books package the conflict with Israel in religious terms. They define it as a ribat. They say a ribat is close to jihad. And they say this ribat against Israel will go on until the resurrection. Not until there's a peace treaty, but until the resurrection. Meaning it's an eternal struggle. So Israel has no right to exist, and ultimately Israel will be destroyed. These are the promises of the school books. The packaging of the conflict as a religious conflict for Allah to Palestinian children is essentially stealing from them any possibility of a future living together within Israel. And in a sense, it's a child abuse to them, because the Palestinian child is given a choice. Either accept your religion or accept the Jewish state. You can't have both.
So does this mean that Israel is wasting its time by trying to negotiate peace agreements?
What we have argued all along is that if we negotiate a peace agreement without first making sure there's an educational process, making sure that there's an environment that can sustain anything that is signed, it will be wasting our time. In fact, worse than wasting our time, we'll be walking into a great tragedy.
And what are the chances that that will happen, that they'll change on their own?
They will, exactly. They will not change on their own. The more they have received, the more they have become intransigent, and the more they have become extreme in their ideology, because they have received in spite of what they're teaching. The only way this will change is if governments like the United States, like the European countries, governments who fund the Palestinian Authority, will use that leverage to demand a change. And I don't mean just the superficial change of the cessation of what they call incitement for 3 weeks or a month. I'm talking about creating maps in the school books where the children see Israel on the map. I'm talking about showing maps on television that they see Israel. Just recently, they started running a clip on Palestinian TV which shows all of Israel, but it's got the colors of the Palestinian flag over it, and it says on it Palestine 2007. And this is Mahmoud Abbas's television. How could Mahmoud Abbas be talking to Israel, be talking to Condoleezza Rice and Bush.
They're trying to tout him as this moderate who's going to bring about peace.
Absolutely. And it cannot happen if the people are taught otherwise. Recently there was a poll in the Palestinian areas, published in the Palestinian newspaper. They asked them, do they recognize Israel's right to exist? The youngest age category was the most extreme. 18 to 25 age category was essentially 90% denied Israel's right to exist, rejected Israel's right to exist. It was the older ones over 60, 65 who 45% denied Israel's right to exist. But at the very youngest age, who've been exposed to Palestinian education and Palestinian television, they totally have rejected Israel's right to exist. So, and that's why I say a peace process must happen, but it cannot happen before the educational process.
Now, what is Israel doing about this? I mean, this is Israel's problem, isn't it? Why are they expecting the Americans or the Europeans to solve it?
Israel can't impose new education on the Palestinians. Israel has suggested, ever since we started working to expose this material, most Israeli governments have worked very closely with us. Benjamin Netanyahu, when he was Prime Minister, appointed me to represent Israel in negotiations with the Palestinians on the problem of incitement. So there has been a recognition on Israel's part to the problem. The problem is Israel has no leverage with the Palestinians. Whatever we demand of the Palestinians, even the cessation of terror, they say, oh, look, Israel's looking for an excuse to not make peace. I mean, so
well, doesn't Israel have its army? Isn't its army the leverage that it has over the Palestinians?
Not really. Our army is very limited. Suicide terror is seen by much of the world as acceptable. And if not acceptable, then at least they understand the motivation. Israel defending ourselves, and whenever there's collateral damage, we get criticized. When terrorists shoot from the Gaza Strip into Sderot, and we shoot at the terrorists and civilians are killed, we get world condemnation. So the army is not enough of a deterrent.
But if Jews are being attacked, if Jews are being killed, wouldn't it make sense to brush off that criticism and say, yeah, we're fighting a war here. These people are trying to kill us. We're not going to let them.
I agree with you. Tragically, Israeli policy has not been that. I spoke at a conference a number of years ago in Israel, and speaking after me was a general in the Israeli army. And this was the height of the terror war, what they called the Intifada. And the general said that when they would have meetings on how to respond to Palestinian terror, they always took into account the world media reaction, which means that Israeli soldiers were dying because of the way the media was responding. The media war then became something that was critical for Israel's survival. That's one of the reasons why we brought our materials, and I started taking our materials around the world, trying to impact on the media, because Israel felt its hands were tied, and if Israel's hands are tied, then people are dying.
I know that your website translates Arabic broadcasts into English. What other languages, if any, do you translate into?
We translate most of our bulletins into French as well. We have done many of our reports in many languages. In Russian, for example, our bulletins go out in Russian.
What about Hebrew? Do people in Israel know?
Absolutely. Our material goes out in Hebrew as well. In fact, we are now creating a new Hebrew website, which will have all the material. In fact, we're creating a new English website as well. We have so much material that we've sort of continued to put on as we've grown that it becomes too much to handle right now. So we're creating a new system, a new search engine. People will be able to go on and pick a theme, let's say Palestinian use of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, for example. They'll go on and they'll get in one moment all of the examples, which surprisingly you will not believe this, are dozens and dozens of examples how they've built even something like the protocols of the Elders of Zion into their ideology. You'll talk about, you'll want to see inciting children to shahada, to martyrdom, and you'll get all the videos, all the texts. So it will be a very, very useful tool for media, for academics, and for just people who want to know the truth of what's really going on.
Who's your intended audience? Who are you really trying to get to? I know you've spoken to the U.S. Congress a number of times. Do you feel that you're really getting through to the people who you want to reach?
We get through to the people who I want to reach as often as I can reach them. When I've been in Washington on many trips, I've met with advisors to President Bush, and it gets through. People see my presentation. The presentation is essentially letting the Palestinians speak for themselves. I show the school books, I show the quotes, I show the television, I show the translations. And I don't have to tell people. People can make the proper conclusions on their own. I'll show them a video that's targeting children and say, this video has been running now for 4 years on Palestinian television. It's been on over 1,000 times, and it brainwashes a child to want to kill himself in order to achieve all the rewards of child heaven, child martyr heaven. And no one needs any explanation that you understand you're dealing with a very, very evil society or an evil leadership who is brainwashing their children to kill themselves for their own political purposes.
Do most Palestinians own television sets? I mean, do they actually see these broadcasts, the average person?
Yes, latest polls we saw close to 90% own television.
And do they also have access to Israeli broadcasts? For example, let's say you live in the Gaza Strip. Can you tune in the Israeli channel and see what Israel has to say and maybe compare the two instead of just swallowing the line that your leaders are giving you?
Theoretically, they do. It would be a matter of what kind of antenna they had. So that if they had a regular ground antenna, they would probably be able to reach it. If they had a satellite dish, then they wouldn't see Israeli TV, because the satellite dish would be a special one for Arabic language stations.
Does Israel make any attempt to reach the Palestinian Arabs with its own message, or does it just leave them to the Palestinian leaders?
Israeli television has Arabic broadcasting daily, and the purpose of this is to reach, initially it was to reach Israeli Arabs. I've heard very strong criticism in recent years of this programming because it's not reaching Israeli Arabs with a moderate message. What's happened is that it has evolved into a mouthpiece for radical Israeli Arabs. And they will interview, for example, the Israeli Knesset members who are viciously anti-Israel at this point, who see themselves openly as representatives of the Palestinian agenda.
So Israel's own media is not even serving the Israeli cause; it's serving its enemy's cause, is what it sounds like.
That is absolutely correct.
Now, is there anybody in Israel, working to change this? Is there anybody saying, this is a conflict, we have to deal with this? We can't let these kind of statements go unanswered. Is there anybody taking any responsibility for that?
Unfortunately, no. And Israel likes to. Israel is a liberal democracy, and we believe in freedom of expression. And we have, in the case of, I think, the Arabic language stations, for example, let the freedom of expression go too far, considering that we're in a war. We're in a wartime. So no Israeli government is going to limit the Arabic language broadcasting because they would be condemned as inhibiting freedom of speech. So let it run wild, and we in fact have a station that's inciting against Israel.
But haven't there been some cases where Israel has limited broadcast stations that took a very strong pro-Jewish point of view, who took the position that, the land of Israel belongs to the Jews, it's not up for negotiations, we're not even going to talk about giving it away? Isn't there a station that basically took that position that was forced off the air?
Yes, that is true.
Because the Israeli government didn't like that message.
Yes, that was a radio station, S.O.T.M.E, and the Israeli government, they were broadcasting from the sea. Technically, it could have been legal. There were other stations that broadcasted from off of Israel's land. And beyond that, there are dozens of stations that got private licenses that weren't the government stations, yet they have refused to give the station a license. It's true.
So it seems like people who are too strongly Jewish, like the government of Israel almost feels more threatened by them than by the Arabs. I've even heard some politicians say that we're more concerned about religious Jews than we are about Arab terrorists.
Yeah, I'm not sure they feel threatened, but they feel they can control them. They're afraid of creating an opposition. They're afraid of creating an opinion that they're happy to control the opinions that they feel can threaten their opinions.
Now, in the Arab media, yes, they're anti-Israel, but do they outright lie? Do they make statements which are actually false accusations that can be easily proven to be false?
Absolutely. So, for example, they create myths. I mentioned before the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They present the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as if it's a legitimate book. I'd say an authentic book. For example, there was an interview once with a person who at the time, if I'm not mistaken, I think he was the Speaker of the Palestinian Parliament. He was being interviewed on television after Israel had released a large number of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for a few Israelis. And he said, you know why Israelis do this? They do this so that they can present the world a feeling of superiority. A few Israelis are worth thousands of Palestinians. So the interviewer said, well, that's what it says in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that Jews are superior and everyone else is inferior. And of course, it was being presented as if it's an authentic book, and there are many examples like this. So, of course, it's an outright lie. They also, of course, distort and create myths about Jewish evil, not just the protocols. I'll give you an example. There was, a number of years ago, an Israeli researcher, I forget his name now, an Israeli academic who was, I think, working on his PhD, and he wrote his PhD about, he created a massacre, which he said happened in an Arab village called Tantura. Now, I think this was in 2001. And he accused a certain brigade called the Alexandroni Brigade of committing this massacre during the War of Independence. And the brigade threatened to sue him, etc., etc. And then later on, he actually apologized, said there actually wasn't, he had wrong information. Now, what was so striking to us, Palestinian television, newspapers were constantly bringing up the issue of the so-called Israeli massacres that were public until that point. For example, they often talked about Deir Yassin, they had memorials, Deir Yassin, they talked about the Israeli massacres, and they'd always mention all the different supposed Israeli massacres. They never mentioned Tantura, which meant that it wasn't even part of their consciousness that this happened. From the moment that this Israeli wrote this thesis, they all of a sudden started talking about Tantura and talking about the massacre, and they were interviewing people who described the massacre. This never happened before. So they heard it was mentioned, and all of a sudden they create the myths. Now, what happened just 2 months ago? They started showing on Palestinian television pictures
I
of...
think your microphone fell off. Without losing a beat, go right ahead.
2 months ago, Palestinian television started showing a documentary on the supposed Tantura massacre, and they've actually showed it 3 times already, including last night, which includes Israeli soldiers lining people up against the wall and massacring them, shooting them with their guns, including women and children.
These are all actors who are
These, of course, are
parts.
actors. Yes, of course, these are actors. So the striking thing is they didn't even have this in their consciousness until it was mentioned, and then even though it was then rejected by the author himself, they continued to present this to their people as a message.
So it sounds like they're willing to say anything at all, whether it's true or not, if it will damage Israel in some way.
A Palestinian had a car accident. The car burnt. He was burnt to death. The next day, the Palestinian newspaper showed the picture of his charred body with a close-up of his head and face, and said, Palestinian, with his name, of course, burnt by Israeli soldiers. After they caught him, burnt his car and killed him. I mean, this is the kind of lies and hatred that's developed.
Now, what's the source of all this hatred? I mean, from what I can tell, Arabs living in Israel have more rights and more freedoms than they would have in virtually any Arab country. They have more economic opportunities and educational opportunities. In fact, now that the Israeli government is talking about giving up certain neighborhoods in East Jerusalem to the Arabs, a lot of Arabs in those neighborhoods are clamoring to retain their Israeli citizenship because they don't want to give up the benefits that go with that citizenship. So it doesn't sound like they're materially oppressed. So what's driving this conflict? Where does this hatred come from that they just are willing to see their own children killed just to kill Jews?
It's a very important question you're asking, because the Palestinians, at the time of the signing of the Oslo Accords, did not have hatred of Israel. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I'll tell you why I know this to be the case. In 1996, from 1996 through 2000, just forget his name for a second. From 1996 through 2000, Khalil Shkaki, who is a pollster, did polls, and he asked Palestinians to rate different places in the world in democracy and human rights. Now, for all those 4 years, the Palestinians rated Israel the best in the world in democracy and human rights. Now, we're talking 1996. This is very significant. This is after 27 years of Israeli administration of Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip. Palestinians thought Israel was the best. 78%, in fact, in 1996 gave Israel a positive rating in democracy and human rights. The next year, it was 77% who gave him a positive rating. The next year, 75%. So it was consistent. It was consistent. The overwhelming majority of Palestinians thought Israel was positive in democracy and human rights.
So what happened?
So what happened was their leadership under Yasser Arafat literally rewrote history for them. We saw this happening from the moment we started monitoring Palestinian television education in 1996. The totally controlled television, the totally controlled newspapers, and the totally controlled education were describing the Jews as these hateful monsters, as people who are trying to kill them, or people trying to make their lives miserable. Now, the people at the time, of course, knew it wasn't true. But as time went on, this was the only message they were getting. And then, of course, they started suicide terror. Suicide terror made Israel have roadblocks. Roadblocks forced Palestinians to start suffering. And slowly, the admiration of Israel started to wear away. So I always say people come and they say, oh, the Palestinians suffered under the occupation. Ridiculous. The Palestinians felt Israel was the best in the world because of Israel's totally exemplary administration for their benefit during the years 1967 through 1994. And let me just give you a couple of examples of why they thought Israel was so good. There was virtually no healthcare system when Israel got there. Life expectancy in 1967 for Arabs was 47. When Israel gave over the land, life expectancy was almost 70. The whole healthcare was developed in Israel. There were no universities. Israel opened 6 universities. Gas, electricity, and water was in less than 10% of the homes when Israel got there. When Israel gave it over, it was in 90% of the homes. Israel brought the Arabs of Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip to the 20th century. And the polls showed that they appreciated this. And they recognized this. And there was no hatred for Israel. But they wanted certain independence. They wanted a political framework. But there was no hatred. They knew Israel didn't make their lives bad. They knew Israel didn't make them suffer. And that's why they thought Israel was the best. Yasser Arafat came after the Oslo Accords. And his goal was to erase those 27 years.
And why did Israel invite him back? At the time Oslo was agreed upon, frankly, I was always opposed to it from the very beginning because I didn't believe Arafat wanted to make peace. For some reason, Israel's leaders seemed to think that he did. But what was their motive in inviting this proven terrorist into the heart of the land of Israel to set up shop? Like he would suppress other terrorists for Israel so they wouldn't have to?
It remains today to be, I think, recognized clearly as one of the great historical mistakes made by Israeli leaders. Supposedly the peace process, not only has it brought more death and destruction, in fact, more Israelis were killed in 1 year during the Intifada than in dozens and dozens of years of normal terrorism. When we would have a year where we lost 10 or 15 people to terror, and we were horrified by it. We'd have a bombing where 3 people were killed, and the country would be in mourning for a week and talk about it. Because of the policy of believing Arafat, we brought, every hour you listen to the radio again and hope that you didn't hear another terror attack, and sometimes you heard one hour, and 3 hours later another one, and they would have way more than 3 people killed. So this was brought on by the Oslo Accords. It was brought on by the blind belief that a terrorist like Yasser Arafat could change. The great challenge today is to figure out what's happening with Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas was Yasser Arafat's right-hand man throughout this entire period.
For about 40 years, I think.
Exactly, through the entire period of suicide terror as well. Yasser Arafat was yelling and screaming peace while he was planning and sending and paying the suicide terrorists and their families. Mahmoud Abbas was right there. Mahmoud Abbas's television continues to present hatred the way it has in the past. The school books continue to present hatred as it did in the past. The burden of proof today must be on Mahmoud Abbas. That he says in English he wants peace with Israel is the most irrelevant thing in the world. Yasser Arafat said it too. I don't know why the Americans are believing him without proof. I don't know why Israel is believing him without proof. If we allow ourselves to be suckered into a false sense of security again, we'll be bringing death and destruction on ourselves again. The burden of proof is on Mahmoud Abbas.
Let me ask you one more thing, because we're running low on time. Let's say that you present your coverage of Palestinian media and take it to the United States and the other big powers, and they say, yeah, we agree with you. We can see that they're dishonest, they want to kill you, their leadership is driven to hate you. But you know what? That's your problem. This is Israel's problem to fix. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to get involved. You can do what you want with the Palestinians, but it's your problem to fix. How would you react to that?
We've never heard that response. We haven't heard that response. Foreign countries are very, very actively involved. They are going to continue funding. I tell them, we are having a conference in European Parliament in December. It's tentatively scheduled. I hope it will happen. The title of which is European Responsibility for the Collapse of the Palestinian Authority. And the point of the conference is I will be showing and documenting all the hate that has been coming through Palestinian television, newspapers, and school books during the last 10 years. And then members of parliament are going to speak and say, look what we funded. We are responsible. We're responsible for the hatred. We're responsible for the war. We're responsible for the death because we funded this blindly. So there is an acceptance of responsibility. Nobody can say we're not responsible. And that's why I've never gotten that response. I get horror. Most of the times people are horrified by what they see. They promise to change. They promise to fix. That has not happened. And I'm hoping that this conference in Europe will at least wake up some of the Europeans coming from the high level that it's coming.
Okay. We're going to have to wrap on that note because we've gotten the signal. Thank you very much for coming.
You're very welcome.
Okay.